My job is Chief Scientist for Global Technology at Deutsche Bank. I do the long-distance strategy and research for data centers, including all the virtualization and cloud technologies.
Great. And next to him, we have Elad Yoran, who is he's the chairman and CEO for Vaultive.
Good afternoon, everybody. Elad Yoran. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I figured that's why they asked me to join this panel on software innovation. My fourth startup, all in the IT security space. So I'm trying to show my perspective on security as it relates to cloud.
Great. Well, thank you, and then looking for a great conversation. Next, I have Gordon Haff, who is Chief Evangelist. I like that title, for Red Hat. So, Gordon.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I'm a cloud evangelist with Red Hat, and I think from a software innovation point of view, the thing that I find really interesting going on is that fundamentally everything that's going on in cloud, whether we're talking public cloud, private cloud, or hybrid, that kind of innovation that's delivered that wouldn't have been possible without open source software, which obviously we've been very involved with at Red Hat.
Great, thanks. And next, I wanted to ask, I have the order on the sheet here, so I'm going to go with that. Greg Brown, who's the VP and CTO at McAfee.
That would be me. So I'm responsible for helping McAfee understand customer needs with regard to adopting security technology and how we can evolve our mid to long-term roadmap to address needs both today as well as in the future at McAfee.
Great, thanks. And then next I have John Ingetz, who's the CTO at Rackspace. I think you guys all got to see him earlier.
Yeah,
great job.
Yeah, thank you. So I am CTO at Rackspace. I've been at Rackspace for about 12 years, and I spend a lot of time in rooms like this, on the road, spending time with customers and partners, and kind of playing a role of evangelist as well. So yeah, I've been around the company for a long time, and I think did you ask if we should chat about what we? Do you want to come back to that? Okay, let's come back to that. All right.
So, and then our last presenter, not least, though, I want to say absolutely up front, it just happened to be the order here, is Reuven Cohen, who's the Senior Vice President for Virtustream.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Senior Vice President at Virtustream. I help sort of strategy around cloud. I'm also quite active, like John, in traveling around and learning about what people want about clouds. I also have the Digital Provocateur column at Forbes magazine, and a variety of other schemes.
Well, great. Thanks, everybody. And thanks for all of you for coming and joining us. I want to kick it off with just a couple quick comments to set the stage here, and that's just what IDC does. We always have to do this. One of the things, since we're talking about software here, we ought to obviously have the question about, well, what are people doing with the cloud today? So where should we be focusing our software? Now, I'd love for you to give me an example of whether you or one of your customers is doing something innovative these days with open source software solutions.
Yeah, I'd say a lot of what's happening in virtualization is being driven by the open source community. In particular, in the area that I'm interested in is some of the virtual switch technology, some of the capabilities around Open vSwitch is really interesting, and the ability to potentially insert your own controls and capability into that infrastructure, leveraging the open nature of that development community, as well as the stuff that's happening around provision with OpenStack and some of the other platforms out there.
And Reuven?
Well, it's interesting that we were chatting about this in the hall briefly. The idea of software is permeates everything. Hardware essentially is software these days. It's just different flavors of it, right? It's a delivery mechanism. In terms of what I see interestingly is big data is everywhere, and the idea of analyzing information in the nearest and fastest way possible creates a competitive advantage for a lot of organizations and companies today. And I was actually did a post recently where I was talking to a large organization. They said that what big data does for us is it changes what used to take months into days or hours, and that's tremendously a game changer for a lot of organizations.
John?
Yeah, so open source, as I pitched in my presentation the other day, at lunchtime, the open source has been a part of what we've done at Rackspace for many years, and so I think the most exciting thing we've gotten involved in and kicked off is OpenStack. I think I'll take a little tiny bit of credit for that, but Rackspace has been a big proponent of open source software all along. We think the cloud ought to be open, and that's where we're going.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that open source is essentially pervasive. So it's hard to name an area of software where it hasn't played a role. I guess if I had to pick out one area that hasn't been talked about yet, in cloud is in many respects management. And so as we look at open source cloud, whether we're talking infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, this seems to be the area where open source is finally coming into management, which is an area that's kind of been slow to get today.
I would agree with the past two comments in the role of open source as being a critical one in the development of cloud, and it really depends on where within the hierarchy you're referring to in terms of infrastructure and platform, where you may not see it as much as at the application level and at the data level. So platform infrastructure and certainly on the management side of things, it has a very important role.
Well, and Andrew, I'll give you the last shot here is sort of the representative end user on the panel.
I mean, I'd certainly agree that the big data and open source is probably the most dynamic area at the moment. Cloudera and Hortonworks in particular, they're charged in those areas. But also distributions, not just on Intel architectures, but on ARM architectures becomes quite interesting as well. So low cost, low power, massive scale out in those spaces. Two other areas really, scale out file systems, like cluster type file systems, that's a very interesting space as we start to think about not just big data in the classical sense, but big data from a file sense as well, and how we manage that whole space. And then the final thing I throw in, management APIs for cloud, and how we start taking the concept of, say, Apache Delta Cloud as a way to lift up above a particular vendor spec and actually put a layer over the top of these APIs. I'm interested in that right now.
Yeah, I think you guys have touched on a lot of great things. I had one interesting person from our company point out is that in a lot of ways, the big data or the analytics area is one where some would argue that that's where open source was first. In a lot of other open source cases, you were trying to do something less expensively, more open that they'd done proprietary before. Whereas in at least some parts of the big data world, open source was there first. And now it's more, can that be sustained or maintained, or are proprietary solutions going to react to that? Any of you guys have any sort of feels on how that's playing out these days? And any things that we should be paying attention to see how that's going to fall?
I point out that analytics is an interesting animal because a lot of cloud, the source code becomes less important, right? It's kind of hidden from view. But in analytics, you still need the code, right? You still need to do something with all that data. You need to transform it into usable, actionable information, and that's especially true when it comes to the code that makes it happen.
Well, I think one of the interesting questions when we start talking about big data is sort of given the analytics engines are open source, but the question is the data itself. What do you have access to? What are the APIs? How open are they? Who owns the data? Who owns the interrelationships between the data? And that's going to be very important around innovation and use of big data technologies in general.
One other thing I didn't hear you guys mention, though, it's sort of tied to analytics, is database. So, open source database or NoSQL or Mongo. So, where do you think that fits in the grand scheme of things right now? That at the core of many businesses from an open source perspective tied to cloud.
I think it's immensely important that platform, one of those, whether it's a Mongo or Cassandra or one of the others, I think they need to be open source, because if you think about that, that's locking your data into a system where it's being stored, it's being indexed, it's being created or whatever, and getting that data out and making that data portable, I think, is going to be critical for the adoption, just like it is for cloud computing. I mean, I think one of the things that's holding people back is this idea of being locked into a particular technology or vendor. Same goes for big data databases, if you will, or NoSQL databases. If you get stuck in one, it's hard to, especially if the vendor's offering it as a service, it becomes very difficult to move.
Anybody else want to chat about that or comment?
Well, you're certainly a move towards lock-in of data. Like that's one of the primary concerns. I think a lot of people are you use a social network, just for example. The information resides there. It's never Facebook, for example. You can't take it anywhere. That's just a consumer example, but there's many other enterprise examples.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of been talking open source here, and I think it's important to emphasize there's a lot of dimensions around openness as we talk about clouds, APIs, data, application portability. I think it's actually open source is great, but I think it's very important that you don't just sort of think open source, check that off, we're done.
Yeah, that's a great transition, Greg, and I wanted to bring that because you brought up the sort of the virtual switch. And so I would say in the last 3-4 months, the hottest thing I've been hearing now is SDN and OpenFlow. So maybe you could just tell the folks what that is, and then we can maybe chat a little bit more about how we see that playing out.
Yeah, so I see it as the next revolution in networking, where in the mid-90s, when IP connectivity was opened up by us invented Cisco, we were locked into a framework, a fixed framework that was offered up by what was called Internet Operating System, iOS. And what SDN and the Open Networking Foundation or the OpenFlow standards are creating is the ability to leverage that switching infrastructure through software definitions. So allowing us to control the behavior of hardware that we know and trust for its connectivity capabilities, and even leverage its routing and infrastructure management capabilities that allow our software to have an increasing impact on how traffic is moved to and fro the network, which is incredibly powerful in giving the data center the flexibility, the agility, the ability to put the infrastructure to work. And I'll quote a statistic that I saw from Facebook the other day. They said the average switch inside any organization gets utilized anywhere between 20 and 30%. And as a network designer, you said, hey, that's great. What Facebook has been able to achieve through software-defined networking technologies is to drive their switching infrastructure to 100% utilization, which is incredible from a CapEx return perspective.
So Elad, I wanted to do one question for you, and we'll go on to the poll question. So a lot of the themes today have been around data. Data storage, data collection, data use, all the things that go in that. That raises the issue about maybe the discussion around security is going to be evolving as well. Clearly we still have to worry about intrusion and some of the identity stuff, but more and more challenges are around no matter where the data is, I need to make sure that it's secure and protected because it can be moving between internal, private. So what are your thoughts about what we can do from the software side to make that more realistic?
Sure, so I think this is sort of the one place where open source sort of ends and the proprietary nature begins, and it's really an organization's data. If you think about the logical extreme of cloud, is that at some point in time, all of us will be using more or less the same IT infrastructure, the same application.
There'll be one giant data center.
And the only differentiator between one organization and the next will be its data, or its people and its data. Will be two differentiators. And so I think you asked the question, who owns the data and what can be done with it? We take a very strict view of that question and believe that the data belongs to the business that generates the data. It's their data. It doesn't belong to the cloud provider, whether it's an infrastructure platform or software as a service provider. And that it's incumbent upon the businesses to retain control of their data no matter where it goes in the cloud. And that there are technologies to do that. We are one company that develops an encryption technology that lets businesses encrypt their data before it goes into the cloud while still preserving the functionality of the server-side processing. There are others, but these kinds of technologies, I think, are going to be critical to enabling the growth of cloud and enabling organizations to move their data into the cloud while still maintaining control, because ultimately they're responsible for the compliance, the security. They're the ones that have to deal with data disclosure, residency requirements, and so forth.
So you're a security side. Should you be nervous here?
I'm not nervous, just simply because a lot of what we do is enabled by an understanding of the threatscape, and that's what McAfee does best. And increasingly, we're dealing with the trustscape as much as we are the threatscape. So what are the good applications, including what are good open source applications, and helping our customers to know that those are the things that are truly running on the servers, not necessarily malware. Sometimes it's easier to say what's good versus what's bad. So that's where a lot of our technology comes into its own, is being able to say yes or no to good or bad stuff.
So Andrew, as the customer, how would you have voted on this?
I'd have voted for networks.
networks?
To me, networks, software-defined networks still is a completely untapped frontier, particularly in the corporate space. These other areas, of course, they're all important, and they're areas where open source has played an impact already. But I think, for me, we're right at the start of the journey on the SDN for corporate.
The issue here is a question. I think that the source part of open source is, it's important, the source code, but it's about access, about open access to the information, the networks, the environments that the cloud enables. So it's APIs, it's a whole slew of things. It's not the source that's as important anymore. Anyway,
it's interesting. There was a technical coordination committee meeting of the ODCA yesterday, and one of the topics was open, and we were just debating one word for an hour about what does that mean.
That's never happened before in the history.
And the interesting thing is we came away from that with an understanding that what we're trying to do with an open data center alliance isn't specifically open source. It's open interoperability and an open opportunity across this space for everybody.
Yeah.
Gordon, I'll give you the last shot, and then we want to open up to the audience here.
I don't know, it seems it really almost seems backwards to me what's here, because, analytics, BI are big, incredible opportunities in networking, as you said, cloud management's happening. In some level, security is really baked into things. I don't see anything that specific to open source that's really revolutionizing what we're doing in security, aside from some individual projects like SE Linux and so forth.
How much are the sort of traditional enterprise ISVs, I'd say, let's be diplomatic, either a help or a hindrance to the move to the cloud? And is that somewhat reflected in what enterprises' priorities have been and where they've tended to use cloud or adopt cloud? And then tying that back into, in some ways, is security also part of maybe that same friction? Because we'll make the joke in IDC, we've been doing research on IT for 48 years. The first time security was at the top of the response for the biggest problem was the day they added the second terminal to the first mainframe. So why don't we go ahead, if you guys want to take a quick shot at the enterprise issue and security.
So it's interesting that you think that cloud would be a place where sort of the emerging applications would reside. What we're seeing in the market is the exact opposite. It's that it's the legacy and how actually are the more commoditized applications that are migrating to the cloud much more rapidly than the newer stuff. If you look at the chart that you started off with, the number one application at the top of the chart was email, if I remember correctly.
Yep, that's what the IT people said. Yes.
Right. And so if you think about email and email, not talking about ISVs. That's the Microsoft-owned world and Exchange. Microsoft, in essence, bet the farm on the cloud with their Office 365 initiative, and they don't sell, Exchange without promoting Office 365. Maybe it's Gmail and Google Apps. They saw the writing on the wall, so to speak. But this is really a tremendous shift for the folks at Microsoft. And so I would argue in that particular case, it's not a new application. It's actually the core legacy application, email, and perhaps the largest ISV in the context of Microsoft that are pushing really hard in that direction. As it relates to security, what we're seeing is, despite the fact that it's a commodity application, email, there is still a reluctance to put it up in the cloud because of concerns over data, privacy, security, disclosure, and compliance.
So anybody else, is it all Oracle's work?
In a way, I think the question's a little bit backwards, to be honest, because organizations are moving to the cloud in whatever form at their own pace, and that's kind of happening with or without Oracle, with or without CA, with and without other large vendors. So it's more that if they're not a threat to the cloud is a threat to them.
So it's totally true. Here's the thing. Software that's getting created today is being created on the cloud. So if you're an enterprise and you're not embracing the cloud, you're being left out of the mix. You can't get the coolest, latest software because it's not being delivered in the traditional means. It's not being delivered on a CD-ROM. You know, if you don't want to use it, then your competitors will and you'll lose.